She walked into my mother-in-law's retirement dinner, wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, and she did it on purpose. I know that sounds like the kind of thing a bitter woman says after the fact, the kind of story people tell themselves to make sense of something that never fully made sense. But I was there. I watched her float through the dining room at the Fairmont in downtown Vancouver, one hand resting lightly on my husband's arm, and I thought, even then, even in that first second, that she had rehearsed this entrance, that she had stood in front of a mirror at home and practiced exactly how to hold her chin. My husband's name is Theodore. We met at McGill when we were both 22, and I have spent 11 years building a life with a man I believed I knew completely. That is the part I keep coming back to. Not the betrayal itself, though that was its own particular kind of devastation, but the confidence I had carried into that marriage. The absolute certainty that I understood who I had chosen. I understand things differently now. Her name was Ingrid. She worked in the same engineering firm as my husband, had joined his project team the previous autumn, and for 6 months leading up to that dinner, she had been something my husband described to me as simply a colleague. The word colleague. He used it the way people use words when they need language to do something very specific and very quiet. My mother-in-law, Genevieve, had given 40 years to the firm she co-founded with her late husband in Burnaby. The retirement dinner was meant to be a celebration. Family, close friends, a few dozen colleagues who had watched her build something from nothing into one of the most respected structural engineering consultancies west of Ontario. My husband's family had roots in the firm. His uncle still sat on the board. His cousin managed 3 of their largest municipal contracts. Ingrid was there because my husband had put her on the guest list. I found that out later. At the time, I assumed she was simply part of the work contingent, one of the 40 or so employees, been formally invited by the firm's HR department as a courtesy. I remember being introduced to her near the bar, and thinking she was pretty in a way that people are sometimes pretty when they want you to notice. Sharp cheekbones. A laugh that arrived just slightly ahead of whatever was funny. She shook my hand and said it was wonderful to finally meet me, and I heard the word finally without fully hearing it, the way you sometimes miss the first sound of a smoke alarm because you've already decided the smell is nothing. My husband was attentive that evening. That is the detail that comes back to me, most strangely. He brought me drinks without being asked. He stood close. He introduced me to people with a warmth that felt genuine and familiar and exactly like him. I went home that night, thinking it had been a lovely evening, thinking my mother-in-law had looked radiant, thinking that the salmon had been slightly overdone, but the dessert table had been exceptional. I did not think about Ingrid at all. That was in October. By February, my brother-in-law, my husband's younger brother Felix, called me on a Thursday afternoon while I was parked outside a Safeway in Coquitlam and said, very quietly, that there was something I needed to know. He had been sitting on it for 3 weeks. He told me that later too, when I asked why he had waited. He said he had been hoping he was wrong. And then he had been hoping it would stop on its own. And then he had realized that hope was just another way of making himself comfortable at my expense. That is not the kind of thing people say when they're lying. I have thought about that moment many times since, that parking lot, the specific gray of a February afternoon in the lower mainland, the grocery bags in my back seat. Felix's voice on the phone sounding like someone who had been carrying something heavy for too long and had finally decided to put it down. He told me what he knew. He told me what he had seen. I sat in that parking lot for 45 minutes before I was able to drive. The next 2 weeks were the kind that leave marks. I am not going to describe them in detail, not because they aren't important, but because some things belong to you. In a way that doesn't translate to telling. What I will say is that I did not confront my husband immediately. I know that surprises people when I tell this story, because the expected thing, the satisfying thing, the thing that makes narrative sense, is the immediate confrontation, the explosion, the plates thrown, or the suitcase packed in one furious hour. But I grew up watching my mother handle difficult things with patience and precision, and I had learned from her that the first instinct is not always the right one. My mother grew up in a small town outside of Quebec City, the daughter of a woman who believed very firmly that you do not spend your capital until you know exactly what it's worth. I heard that my whole childhood. You don't spend your capital until you know what it's worth. So I waited. I watched, and I made some calls. My family is not what most people would call powerful in any obvious way. We are not the kind of family that appears in the business section of the Globe and Mail. But my father spent 30 years as a senior partner at a firm that handles commercial real estate law across 4 provinces, and my uncle sits on the board of a pension fund that manages assets for most of the major construction unions in BC. And my aunt, my mother's sister, is a retired judge from the British Columbia Court of Appeal who, when she calls in a favor, finds that favors tend to be returned. What my husband had never fully understood, what he had perhaps never thought to consider, is that when he married me, he also married into a network that quietly underpinned a significant portion of the legal and financial infrastructure through which his family's firm operated. 3 of Genevieve's firm's largest municipal contracts had required legal sign-off from partnerships, where my father's colleagues held influence. The financing on the firm's new Burnaby office building had been arranged through a commercial lender, whose board my uncle's fund helped capitalize. None of this had ever mattered before. We had been happy, or I had thought we were happy. But it mattered now. I did not set out to do anything dramatic. I want to be clear about that, because I think the story of what happened gets flattened sometimes into something that sounds like revenge. And it wasn't revenge. It was consequence. There is a difference, even if the results look similar from the outside. What happened was this. My husband's firm had been shortlisted for a significant infrastructure project in the Fraser Valley, a contract that would have been the largest in the firm's history, worth somewhere north of $40 million, and the kind of project that gets firms like theirs onto a different tier entirely. The decision was expected to come down in late spring. The firm had spent 18 months on their proposal. My mother-in-law had considered this contract her legacy project, the thing she was handing off to the next generation as proof that what she built could keep growing. My husband knew all of this. He had been the lead on the proposal team. He had also, during those same 18 months, been lying to me. I am not going to pretend I engineered what happened next with cold precision, because that's not entirely true. The truth is messier than that. The truth is that I talked to my father. And my father, who has known me for 32 years, and could hear in my voice exactly what was happening, made a quiet phone call to someone he had known for 20 years. And that person made a quiet phone call of their own, and the question that began moving through certain channels was not a hostile question. It was simply a question about process. About whether the appropriate due diligence had been completed. About whether there were any undisclosed relationships or conflicts of interest in the team composition. It was a procedural question, the kind that gets asked all the time. But when that question is asked at the right moment by the right person, it has a way of causing proposals to be re-examined very carefully. I found out what happened next from Felix, who found out from their cousin who was on the board. The review took 3 weeks, and what the review found was not anything criminal. There was nothing fraudulent in the proposal itself, but what it found was that my husband had been managing a personal relationship with a member of his project team for the duration of the proposal period. A relationship that had not been disclosed as required under the firm's own conflict of interest policy. A policy, it turned out, that was referenced explicitly in the terms of the municipal contract tender. The contract went to another firm. I did not find out about this at a dinner, or a gala, or any kind of event with chandeliers and champagne. I found out sitting at my kitchen table in the house my husband and I had bought together in East Vancouver, on Slice Tuesday morning in April, when Felix called me again. His voice sounded different this time. Not the same snatched as February. Something quieter. He said, "They lost the contract." And then he said, "Theodore knows why." The moment that stays with me is not what happened in the days after, though those days were significant. It is not the conversation where my husband finally sat down across from me and stopped using the word colleague. It is not the meeting with my lawyer, or the conversation with my mother, or the very long evening my father and I spent on his back porch in Kerrisdale, with mugs of tea going cold between us, not saying much of anything. The moment that stays with me is something smaller. It was a Sunday afternoon, maybe 2 weeks after everything had settled into its new shape. I was at my mother-in-law's house in North Burnaby. Genevieve had asked me to come by, and I had gone, because whatever had happened between her son and me, she had been kind to me for 11 years, and that is not something you put down easily. We were sitting at her kitchen table with tea, and she looked at me for a long time without saying anything, and then she said, "I should have seen it." I told her she couldn't have known. She shook her head. "Not about him," she said, "about you." I didn't understand what she meant at first. She told me then. Told me what she had never said directly, what she had perhaps not fully understood herself until all of it had come apart. That she had watched me for 11 years and had spent most of that time thinking of me as her son's wife. As a pleasant, capable woman who loved her son and organized nice dinners and had a father who was in law. She said she had not understood until those 3 weeks of silence, until watching a $40 million proposal collapse without any visible force being applied, that I was not simply someone's wife. She used the word formidable. In French it doesn't sound the same as it does in English. In French it means something closer to extraordinary, something closer to awe. I am telling you this not because I want you to think I am someone to be feared, because I don't think that's true. I think I am someone who grew up watching the women in her family handle hard things quietly, and who learned eventually that quiet is not the same as weak. My husband and I separated in May. The paperwork was handled efficiently. He has moved to an apartment in Yaletown. Ingrid, as far as I know, is still employed at the firm, though the firm is navigating a difficult year, without the contract they had counted on. I have heard, through the particular grapevine that small professional communities always maintain, that she has learned something about the cost of certainty. I hope she has. Not out of bitterness. I have tried very hard to put bitterness down, because it is a heavy thing to carry, and I have other things I'd rather carry. But because I think there is something genuinely useful in understanding that when you walk into a room and raise a glass to your own victory, it is worth pausing to check who else is in the room. The Fairmont dinner stays with me, not because it was the moment anything broke. Things were already broken by then, I just didn't know it yet. It stays with me because of the way she walked in. The practiced chin, the laugh that arrived early, the handshake and the word finally. She had thought she was the most important person in that room. She had not looked carefully enough at the room. My mother and him built 40 years of something real out of discipline and precision, and the understanding that nothing holds without its foundations. And she was retiring that night surrounded by the people who had watched her do it. My father was there, near the back, talking quietly with my uncle near the windows overlooking the harbor. My aunt had sent flowers because she was in Ottawa that week, but her name was on the card, and people in that room knew her name. I was there in a navy dress I'd bought at Holt Renfrew the previous spring, drinking sparkling water because I'd had a headache earlier in the day, watching my husband bring drinks to a woman who had decided, somewhere along the way, that my life was an obstacle rather than a fact. She had not done her research. That is what I keep coming back to. Not the betrayal, not the contract, not the particular quiet of an April Tuesday, when everything finally became real. Just that fundamental failure of attention. She had looked at my husband's family and seen an engineering firm. She had looked at me and seen a pleasant woman in a navy dress. She had not asked what was underneath either of those things, and that, in the end, is what made all the difference.